Welcome to the Filofox podcast with me, Rebecca, your personal organiser and declutter coach. Hello and welcome to the Filofox podcast. I am so excited for this episode. I've been waiting for this for months, actually since I met Professor Nick Neave, who's with me today, the director of the Hoarding research group at Northumbria. And wow, what a fascinating subject. Welcome, Professor Nick Neave, to the Filofox podcast.
Hello, hello.
So we first met at an event last year, a meetup about the minimalist, which is completely the opposite of what you're probably studying right now, but they're all in the same box, aren't they? It was a mix of things from minimalism to extreme hoarding. Now, I've been reading a little bit and obviously took on board your presentation. So let's just start with an introduction to what you do and how you came to do it.
Okay, as you said, I'm the director of the Hoarding research group. I'm a psychologist, and I'm very much interested in people's personality and how those kind of different aspects of personality, and also how aspects of a person's kind of social history and environment can have an impact upon their behaviours. And the behaviours that I'm particularly interested in are hoarding behaviours. I was always a little bit of a collector. As a child, not so much as an adult, but I had a very kind of fascination for collecting, the usual kind of stamps and football stickers and coins and kind of stuff like that. And I was very interested in looking at the kind of personality of collectors. That was where it kind of started out. And then that very quickly branched out into looking at hoarders, because there's quite a bit of overlap between hoarders and collectors. The current literature tells us that they are in fact two different groups. We weren't quite so convinced about that. We felt that a lot of collectors had a lot of kind of hoarding tendencies, and a lot of hoarders had a lot of collecting tendencies. And I thought it was quite... I didn't think that there were really two completely separate groups. So we initially started out with some research. We tried to devise a questionnaire, which we called the Hoarding Collecting Questionnaire, to try and see if we could differentiate between hoarders and collectors. And indeed, we could. Some people seem to be very, very much straight down the line hoarders. They tick all the boxes in the literature. They have far too much stuff. They accumulate stuff. They have very great difficulty getting rid of stuff. There seems to be a real emotional connection to that stuff. They anthropomorphize. They kind of treat inanimate objects as if they have emotions and feelings. And they seem to be a kind of a separate core group of people. We also found a group of people who were very, very much like collectors. They were very focused. They were very organized. They tended to collect a certain type of thing, whether it's stamps or coins or medals or something like that. They were, they knew what they got. They knew how much they paid for it. Everything was ordered, categorized, stored, displayed. They knew exactly what they got, where they got it, and whatever. And that really differentiated them from the hoarders, who have tons and tons of stuff. They don't necessarily know what they've got. They might have it. It's buried away somewhere. Even if they did know they'd got it, they couldn't find it again. There's no categorization. There's no order. But very, very interestingly, we found evidence that there was a third group of people. And these people seem to share the connections between hoarders and collectors. They seem to have the same kinds of attributes. So they also had too much stuff. They tended to look like collectors in that they had specific types of stuff, but it wasn't just one focused thing like a collector would have. They might, for example, a collector who collected medals would collect medals. Other people, these kind of group in the middle, they might collect military stuff, but they'd have medals, they'd have helmets, they'd have uniforms, they'd have all manner of stuff, and they wouldn't necessarily know where they'd got it, how they got it, where it was, and they kind of stored it like hoarders did. They kind of piled it all together, chucked it in a corner, whatever. And we we thought that these people would be rather thin on the ground. We thought, yes, there'd be loads of collectors, loads of hoarders, and very few of these people who we kind of call hoarder collectors. And yet, in fact, there seemed to be quite a lot of them. And when we looked at the personality characteristics of hoarders versus collectors, again, you see these quite big differences. The personalities of a collector seem to be quite different to the personality of a hoarder. But the hoarder collectors had connections. They seem to have the same elements, some elements of a hoarder's personality and some elements of a collector's personality. So that's kind of where we started off. One of my problems, though, as a psychologist, is that we're surrounded by thousands of students, young people typically. So we have a lot of access to these people, and they tend not to be, hoarders or collectors, or if they are, there's not a lot of them about, and also they're very, very young. If you look at a hoarder who's maybe starting out hoarding in their teens or 20s, they haven't got that much stuff because you need a lifetime to accumulate this kind of stuff. So we had a problem in that we couldn't access people who were in their 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, living in the real world, not, on a university campus. Fortunately, though, my wife is a housing officer. She works for Newcastle City Council as a housing officer. And I mentioned this to her, saying, we need to I can't get access to real hoarders and people with these real kind of issues. And she said, well, we've got loads of them. We have real problems with hoarders. They're a great issue for housing associations. They are, there's issues about health and safety. There's issues about vulnerability. There's a lot of these other really quite complicated stories related to these people. Mm-hmm. So I then began to make connections with all the local councils and the local housing authorities and the local environmental teams. And as soon as I mentioned, this was about 3 years ago, as soon as I said, we're setting up a hoarding research group in the university, we're keen to make links with all the various local authorities and people who might have dealings with people who hoard, my hand was bitten off. People seem to be incredibly desperate to find solutions or to gain more insight into these people, these very kind of often, psychologically interesting people who they were dealing with on a daily basis and were getting nowhere. Mm-hmm. There is no cure for hoarding as yet. It's still quite a mysterious condition. Different people seem to show slightly different aspects of it. Some people, for example, are what's called dirty hoarders or wet hoarders. They often, there's cases of people hoarding urine in jars or feces or just rubbish. Mounds and mounds and mounds of festering foodstuffs and rubbish. Other people seem to be what's called dry hoarders or clean hoarders. They might hoard books or newspapers or magazines or clothes, and these things tend to be, they create less environmental problems. You can still get squashed to death by a falling pile of books, etc. It's still dangerous, but in terms of environmentally, these people are quite different. The literature, the kind of current research understanding, a lot of which has come from the United States, doesn't seem to differentiate these people. If you score highly on a certain hoarding questionnaire, you're a hoarder. End of story. And yet, if you read the case studies of people who have hoarding problems, there seems to be quite a few different types of hoarders. And that insight might be very useful, because how you would maybe give psychological counselling or therapy or help to a certain person with certain symptoms would be very different to how you treat somebody else. And again, that's not really reflected in the kind of current models, which is, let's give CBT therapy. Because one of the problems was hoarding, when it was first recognised, really, was lumped under the OCD disorders. It was treated as a variant of OCD, and yes, people with OCD can hoard. A lot of them don't.
Do you think, listening to that, my first question is, in terms of the collecting point of view, when people are organised and very studious about it. It's almost like there's an OCD element to
Yes,
collecting,
yes,
isn't there?
yes.
And I think when we talk about where hoarding originated from, Wikipedia says, oh, well, it's the 1980s, post-war, where there was scarcity, and then people started associating with having things with success, with it was a security blanket because maybe of the scarcity. So, but actually, it's not actually correct, because as you said in your presentation, the Collier brothers was the first time that there was this recognition of this
Yes.
in 19, was it 47, around
I
that
think,
time?
yes, yes, it was around about then. Yes, yes. That was the first recognised case of hoarding, but these were two wealthy individuals and very odd individuals, and they had the money and the room to kind of acquire all of these things. Hoarding, I mean, for example, Charles Dickens mentions refers to a hoarder. Other authors have kind of referred to, they've never called them hoarders, that kind of name didn't exist, but throughout literature and throughout history, people have been identified as people who hold on to possessions that they don't really need to hold on to, and that these people seem to have a much more stronger emotional connection to these possessions than other people do.
Mm-hmm.
And again, there's been some kind of insight into the fact that a lot of these people, that can be traced back to some kind of trauma.
Mm-hmm.
Now, there's a lot of stuff done after the war with people who'd been as prisoners of war, and people who'd been in concentration camps, and people in, for example, the UK, where there was food rationing. And a lot of the hoarding behaviours that we saw after the war seem to reflect that. So people would say, "Oh, I'm going to buy 5 bags of sugar because you never know when we might get rationing again." And other people would say, well, when I was a prisoner of war, I had very, very few possessions, and those possessions really meant something powerful to me. It was a little toy that my son had given me before I went off to fight. And then they've got collections of toy soldiers after that. You know, you can trace it back and see where that originating point came from. And you can see that there's common sense there. People are thinking, I'm missing something here. I'm going to make sure that I don't get into that situation again. Mm-hmm. So I think in many, many cases, you can see where the behaviours have come from. Other people, it seems to be back in the mists of time, and it does seem to be linked with, in some people, some kind of childhood trauma.
Yeah.
And that's often cases where there's maybe been abuse, or people have lived in very challenging environmental circumstances where perhaps they didn't have many possessions, parents were moving from house to house, and there was a lot of chaos and disorder in the relationships. And there does seem to be some link with emotional connectivity with adults. Mm-hmm. And there is a suggestion that hoarders, some hoarders, so as I've said, there are kind of different types of hoarders, but some hoarders, they latch on to possessions because those possessions don't hurt you. They are reliable, they're trustworthy, whereas adults and other people, in their experience, tend not to be. So I think that, there are different types of hoarding, but it can all be traced back to some kind of issue or some kind of behavior or some kind of environmental setting. And again, what's caused your hoarding as an adult is going to be different between different people. And so you can't just treat hoarding, you've got to go back to the point, the kind of trigger for that hoarding, and treat that person as an individual rather than just somebody who's a hoarder, because we don't really know what that means.
No, and the definition is the inability to let go of things and attaching emotions to the items, like you say, of some kind. And there's a common trait where people think that the people who hoard or collect, or even in extreme, are dysfunctional in society, and yet there are people who are high up. It's not always the case. There are people who maybe have social anxiety, or who do stay in all the time and unable to go out and unable to socialize and connect. But there are people, high professional people who are hoarding, who are still like you say, we're all humans. We've all come from somewhere. It's not necessarily to do. It's just as a human being and your experiences and conditioning. One of the things that I have to do when I go into each household or business is actually read people very quickly, and the type of language that you use differs with every single person, and it's that ability to read a situation very quickly and gently, tentatively find your way around their thought processes and what would put their walls up. And I think, like you say, it is hugely personal. It's very personal, and it's trust in you. But I think when we're looking at hoarding, and my fiance won't mind me saying that he's had hoarding tendencies, and then the differentiation between collections. So, for instance, we have about 3,000 DVDs in our house, and they are all world cinema, different genres, but they are all housed on shelves and not necessarily in, I would call, a very specific order, although I'd like to do that.
Right.
And maybe genres would be the way around it, because alphabetically would be an absolute nightmare.
Yes.
But
that's a collection, not a hoard.
Yeah.
That's not a hoard.
And yet, every time we visit Edinburgh, we go to FOP. Another 5 will be added to that collection. But he actually knows what he's got.
Yes, that's a collection then.
Yeah, so that's a collection, but he also has lots of other collections.
Right. So he sounds like a hoarder collector then.
Yeah, so it probably fits into that category.
Yes.
But then when you look at hoarding, there isn't any therapy really specific to it. And like you say, it's a very difficult one to actually, I suppose, develop, because of the very individual needs of each person.
Yes.
And so your research is trying to find that as generic but helpful solution, because GPs call it a lifestyle, don't they? And what concerns me is the people who are not in social housing, who the councils and housing associations don't know about.
Exactly. There is I mean, when we did our surveys with the councils, we found quite a few hoarders. One of the problems with the housing associations, though, is if you're a good tenant, if you pay your rent on time, if your hoard or collection doesn't spill out into communal areas, if the gas man can come in and read your gas meter, and the electric man can read the electric meter, nobody bothers about you. You're okay. We found the kind of tip of the iceberg, really, and we found all the kind of problem cases, the ones who were hoarding foul things and horrible things, and their stuff was spilling out into a communal area. Then actions can be taken, and certainly in the old days, the council's response was to evict people, but that didn't work, because these people then go back into the system somewhere else, and the problem never gets solved. They're churned around the system. The councils have realised that now, because with changes to the Social Care Act in 2014, these people are classed as vulnerable. There are safeguarding issues, and it's now much more friendly, if you like, towards these people, because they're now, the councils have realised that we need to help them rather than try and victimise them. The problem is they then can't refer them on anywhere else, because there's no specific hoarding treatment. If you do fall into that small category of a person with OCD and hoarding, where cognitive behavioural therapy might well be very useful for you, that's only about 20% of hoarders. And so the remaining 80%, and of course it could be these people who've got different types of hoarding caused by different traumatic or other experiences. So they're not the same bag, they're not the same kind of person. It's very, very difficult at the minute to take it further than that and to try to resolve these issues. It's very labour intensive. You need to be highly specialised and highly, the kind of things that you do, you have to see people each as a unique individual. treat that person as an individual person. But it's labour intensive, it's difficult, it's long-winded, and certainly at the moment in lockdown, it's virtually impossible for anybody to get any help at all. So it's a very tricky situation, I think.
And I think it's finding the compromise, because if you are alone and you're hoarding, like you say, it gets out of hand and spills into the community, and then they have to look at it because it's a fire issue or environmental issue. It's affecting your day-to-day living, cooking, personal hygiene, all of those things. But then if you're a hoarder I suppose in the extremes, it's difficult to be a hoarder when you share space with somebody in the extreme, because if they're not that, then they're likely to highlight the problem. But if you're sort of verging on where one person's hoarding is getting out of hand and affecting the environment of the people that you share that space with. And I have worked with clients where I've had one who's OCD and one who's hoarder.
Right.
And then you have to find that middle ground where
yes.
both
Yeah.
can function
Yes.
in, and also establish habits that will be long term. And it's maybe pie in the sky, but my ultimate aim is for everybody never to need me again.
Right. Yes. Yes.
Because then I know they've got to that middle ground, and and I think that's really important, is to find compromise, isn't it? Because there isn't an actual solution. It's finding common ground within either that person that's on their own or within that family to say, okay, these are the tendencies, and we can look at all of the elements individually that have maybe resulted in this hoarding and this needing of security or feeling successful, or here's what I've got and look at how wonderful it is. But then there's also, let's touch on another section of it, which is impulsive purchasing, and as opposed to intentional. And I think in lockdown, we're all looking at our impulsive purchases and thinking, and looking at how much money we are saving by actually not moving around as much, not having the temptation, although there is online, but there's something about, and I've done it myself, gone into a charity shop, saw something in my size, it's brand new, and somebody else has donated it, and you're thinking, wow, well, I've got to have that because it fits me, and it's brand new. But then my advice to people who do that is to actually walk away at least half an hour and say to yourself, do I really need this? And is there something at home that I could actually part with before I actually bring it in? But that's a certain, again, habit that you need to get into, and does take work, doesn't it? So that I know people who buy several of the same item and just keep it.
There is evidence that compulsive shoppers are different. They're not hoarders. They get the pleasure, they get the kind of the rush, the kind of pleasure of getting hold of something. They then don't necessarily are bothered about keeping it. And in fact, we know that hoarders, for example, their problem is the difficulty in getting rid of stuff. You can stop them getting stuff. They seem to be quite happy about being prevented from getting hold of stuff, but getting them to part with that stuff is incredibly difficult. The compulsive shoppers are the complete opposite. It's it's quite easy to get them to get rid of stuff. They're quite happy to sell it on eBay, to donate it to charity, to get rid of it. But to them, it's very difficult to get them to stop getting stuff. So again, we're seeing, I mean, the end product is people have too much stuff. And they're all seen as being the same type of people, but in fact they aren't. There seems to be different triggers, different emotional rewards for different aspects of this, purchasing behaviour or obtaining behaviour. And I think we've literally just before lockdown, we started a project looking at the kind of personality characteristics of compulsive shoppers and seeing how they differed from hoarders. We've had to obviously trim that down a little bit. It's going to take a lot longer to do that, but one of the key things is that we're trying to find out these different types of hoarders, these different types of behaviours, how they're linked with different kinds of environmental or kind of social experiences, and how that then might enable us to kind of think about kind of treatment regimes for different types of people in these different types of categories. At the moment, it's just everybody's lumped into the same bag, hoarder.
Mm-hmm.
And we think that that's wrong.
When I look at decluttering, I actually do say it's when I'm helping people declutter and they're looking at the quantity they have, and I say to them, it's actually not, for me, but from my opinion, it's not quantifiable. It's when it's too much for you.
Yes.
To function, and it's getting on top of you, but it's also, if it's at the extreme, it's stopping you, as I said before, from functioning with your daily tasks.
Yeah.
Because one of the things that is apparent in every single person is this element of shame and guilt. And I say to them, I'm not here to judge, I'm not here to look at the amount. What I'm here is to help you keep the things that mean something to you or have a functional need, and help you store them in a way that you can function, and that your space that becomes a place of pleasure rather than a place of stress. So when we do declutter, we are decluttering our mind as well. And then I say to them, when you have space in your head to be creative and to actually think about things that you'd like to do, then the whole new world opens up.
Yes.
Right now, the clutter that you come home, maybe you're at work and you come home to clutter, you're immediately on a downer because your brain's not only full from work and you actually want to release some of that. But you can't because you're coming into a space that doesn't serve you, basically.
And I think you're doing exactly the right thing. We're never going to cure people, because this, the desire to obtain possessions is completely normal. It's what makes us human. It's part of our personality. It's part of our social life. Possessions are important to us, so we can't stop people from doing that. Some people do it to extreme. I think the best thing that we can do is to manage that individual so that they can feel happier and safer in their own environment compared to somebody else.
Mm-hmm. You're right, and I think that's, like you say, there isn't a cure, but there is that recognition, isn't there? And I think when you get to a point where there's a realization and you ask for help, that is the hardest bit, I think. When you that self-awareness to say, actually, you know what, I've got to the point, I'm having this light bulb moment or this realization where I can't go on like this. But then there's also that recognition of taking action, that you actually need to take action, and it may not be a nice journey for a little bit, but convincing people that the outcome will be so fantastic and the release will be so lovely that they'll actually get a buzz for the outcome on a regular basis, because we have to revisit decluttering, we have to revisit our collections and our all the time.
It's a constant process, isn't it?
And I think if so in terms of your research, it's ongoing and it's very deep, and there is, for me, it's like an onion. There are several layers, and getting to the core to it will take some time. But what do you hope to achieve in terms of help? Do you think that you'd be able to develop a course that, such as there's a lot of coaches that do all of these NLPs and CBTs and psychologists and all of this. What is your aim as in terms of help? Do you think there'll be a course for people like me to sort of take and say, okay, I've done this course, I'm much more aware of a lot more things through your research, so therefore I'm able to help, not actually have the audacity to think that I could cure somebody, but actually help them on their journey in the long term? Do you think that's what will be the end product of what you do? Although I don't think there will be an end. I think it's an ongoing thing.
No, you're right. I think that is the end point. I think that before you can help somebody with something, you need to understand what it is. and you need to understand how and why that person's got to the place that they are now. And at the minute, we're kind of seeing the end point.
Right.
And people are filling in their hoarding questionnaire. Oh, you're a hoarder, you're scoring very high on this, let's do this. I think certainly one of the things that we're thinking about is to take that step a little bit further backwards and say, okay, what's caused this? Because I think you can never, ever help somebody unless you understand what's led to that behaviour happening. And at the minute, then, we're trying to understand what all these behaviours are, because if there are 4 or 5 or 6 different types of hoarding, then we need to understand what they are and all the characteristics that are associated with that person. And then we need to trace back to see how they link to social experiences and environmental experiences and kind of personality, and also to how they attach to people and how they attach to objects. The more that we understand about all these different things, we'll then be in a position to be able to say to therapists, okay, if this person's showing these kinds of characteristics, this is the line that you might want to think about taking to help them. Again, we're not going to cure anybody, because people are being human. They they have emotional problems. We all do. They gather possessions around them because that's gives you pleasure, and it's like an emotional comfort blanket. And again, that's fine. We all do that. But it's where that cutoff point is between somebody who's doing this excessively and somebody who's, we can contain that within a kind of a normal situation, such that they're not impaired and that their families aren't suffering as well.
Mm-hmm. And do you think that sort of help will be available to people who aren't psychologists, like myself?
Yes,
who goes into home?
I don't think you need to be a psychologist specifically to be able to do this. I mean, there are many people who've got qualifications in different types of therapies. They haven't come from a psychological point of view necessarily. I think those people will be just as good. It's just having that insight into what's gone wrong and how we can best help that person in that situation at this point in time. No, I think it should be something that we should hopefully. You don't need a degree in psychology to be able to fathom out. It's just people behaving like people. Yeah. But it's no, I don't think it'll be as complex as that.
Fantastic. Well, I look forward to that then, and being able to help more people. So I really appreciate you joining today and giving a little bit of insight into what you do and the hoarding. And as I say, I think in lockdown we are looking at our basic needs more, where you touched on the shopping. Initially when there was lockdown, we couldn't get hold of a lot of things.
Yes.
And people were going out and buying in excess of their needs in panic. Because there was a looming crisis coming that they had seen happen elsewhere. And I think also the fact that we're in our environment a lot more than we have been, a lot of us. Yes. I mean, I know there's exceptions to everything. I think there's this common phrase going around at the moment that we're all right in the same storm but in different boats.
Yes.
And when we mustn't compare boats, because then we can start getting a little bit hard for, there's so many different variables and situations.
Yeah.
But I think we are looking at our basic needs, and I personally think out of this will come an appreciation for those basics. We've just been without our boiler for a week, so no hot water or heat for a week, and which has been a little bit of a nightmare. But and I think because we're in the environment 24/7, apart from our walks, it's more up there, isn't it?
Yes.
And I think when we're looking at our collections, our possessions, everything, there's a lot of people doing a bit of decluttering at the moment, but they're complaining that they can't take it anywhere, so it's actually piling up in a corner because it can't go to a charity shop or the tip or whatever. But I think when we come out of this, there will be a reset, and I actually wonder how long that reset will last, or whether we will go back into the habits that had before.
Yes.
But then the length of time that we're here determines that, because I think if it was just a couple of weeks, we'd probably, it's like a holiday.
Wouldn't make a difference, would it?
But the longer we stay this process, and it will be different. Maybe I think there will be a new norm.
Yeah.
And we'll all come out differently in some respect from it, because we'll all have had different experiences.
I kind of expect that people will not be as bothered about possessions because they didn't really do anything, but I think people will be much more keen to meet other people and to have that social connection again. I think that's what people are missing. And yes, you've got your families, you've got video calls, but it's not the same as sitting in a cafe or a pub with a bunch of people and just talking rubbish. I think that's that's a key thing which will change.
And I think that's one of the nicest, we're all aware of the tragedies of the situation, which again is at one point. And at the other point, we're aware of the nicer things that are going to come out of it. And there's been huge examples, of kindness.
Yes.
Care, the fact there's a new care emoji now on Facebook.
Yeah.
But, there's this care and kindness and this common ground every Thursday evening at 8 o'clock.
Yeah.
And I got quite emotional a couple of weeks ago because my granddaughter had heart surgery during the peak of the lockdown. And it was just, and then feeling that sort of connectivity with everybody else, I was almost, I was clapping for her and everything.
Yeah.
There was this, I felt almost like everybody else was clapping for her as well,
I think hopefully it'll bring out a greater appreciation of the people who do care for other people and are in the kind of care services. They've been under appreciated for many years, and you'd hope that would change. That could be a good positive thing which comes out of this. We don't need footballers earning millions of pounds a week. We need people who actually care for other people. So I think you're right. There's going to be some interesting changes possibly as we emerge from this odd situation.
It is, yeah. I think, and we're part of history. People were talking about this for a very long time. And actually, I'd just like to wish you all the best in your research.
Yes,
and
yourself.
And let's see where this journey takes us. And I'm excited to be sharing this podcast with everybody because I think it gives a little bit of insight into the psychology of hoarding, collecting, decluttering, minimalism, OCD, and that we're all, at the end of the day, we are all human.
Yeah, and we're just being people, normal.
Being people, but it's when it starts affecting our day-to-day life that we actually have to look at things a little more closely.
That's right.
Thank you, Nick.
That's right. Thank you, Rebecca.
Thank you.
Keep well.
And you. Stay safe.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.